If you don't have a copy of it, you can go to Sunnah.com. Sunnah.com. Please pull it up on your phone, your laptop, and inside of there, you can navigate yourself to Imam An-Nawawi's 40 Hadith. Inshallah. Barakallahu fi. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. So today I wanted to start out by looking at hadith number 4 of the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi. Last week we covered a hadith from the Arba'in that's in Bukhari, but we saw that there was a mistake, that the way Imam Nawawi related the hadith, it wasn't really in Sahih al-Bukhari, and there was a key problem in that hadith, so there was a mistake in that hadith. So continuing along, there's another example, and that's hadith number 4. So if any of you have your app, like I want one of you to read the hadith with me. So if you go on 40 hadith and number 4, you can read it from an app, or anybody has it, just raise your hand. All right, Brother Mustafa. So read you have the Arabic and English? Okay, read the Arabic. I'll tell you when to stop. Okay, stop there. So this hadith is number 4. It's a hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. And it's an important hadith. All of you have learned it and studied it. So So Imam Nawawi relates from Abu Abdurrahman, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu, قال حدثنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وهو الصادق المصدوق. So Ibn Mas'ud says, starts his hadith in a slightly different way. So Ibn Mas'ud says, usually a hadith is قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. So here he says, حدثنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. The Messenger of Allah related to me. Okay, so he's using the same hadith language, but he extends it to the Prophet ﷺ. And then he says, وَهُوَ الصَّادِقُ الْمَصْدُوقُ. He is the truthful one, the one who, what does it say in the translation? Does it have that translated? It's what? Oh yeah? Okay.
He says, and he is the truthful, the believe.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud says, the Prophet ﷺ related to me, and he is sadiq, truthful, and masduq, one who is believed, like his truthfulness is accepted. So that tells you something, that the way this hadith begins is slightly different. And why is Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, you have to ask questions. Why does he have the need or feel the need to say, وَهُوَ صَادِقُ الْمَصْدُوقُ? Usually you don't have that in hadith. In hadith you just have قَالَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّم. So here Ibn Mas'ud, before he relates the words of the Prophet, he gives this preamble that the Prophet is sadiq and masduq. You know, this is the active participle and the passive participle. He is truthful in what he says, and his truthfulness is accepted. So that tells you that this hadith is something strange. Hadith is going to have some unusual information that people might have issues with. And that's why he gives this preamble. Okay, so now read the first part of the hadith.
إن أحدكم يجمع خلقه في بطن أمه 40 يوما نطفة.
Nutfatan, okay. And then what's the translation of that? Verily,
Verily, the creation of each one of you is brought together in his mother's womb for 40 days
okay.
in the form of a nutfa,
Okay.
a drop.
Okay, so the first thing here is each one of you is brought forward in the womb of your mother, fi batni ummihi 40 yawman, 40 days. And then it says nutfatan. So it didn't translate nutfa, I guess, right?
No, he did. He put as a drop.
Drop. Okay, good. So this hadith is talking about, you know, to some extent embryology. So each one of you is in your mother's womb for 40 days, nutfatan, as a drop of fluid. Nutfa. So these are the stages of a human being development. The first stage is nutfa, and that's from the Quran too. Maybe we can look at some Quranic verses too later. But nutfa is basically the first stage, just a drop of fluid. This is after fertilization. The embryo is very early. It's just like a drop of fluid. Okay? And then what's the second part after that? ثم مثل ذلك. And then it is a alaqa for the similar period. What does it translate?
And then it becomes an alaq, meaning a clot of blood.
Okay. Alaqa. Clot. Drop of fluid, clot. And then what's next? Translation?
Translation is, and then a morsel of flesh for a light period.
Okay. Let me change the color here. Huh?
Yes.
For a light period, yes. Okay. So you got nutfa, 40 days, drop. Then it changes into a clot for a light period. Then a mudgha for a light period, for a similar period. Okay. Let's finish the hadith, then I'll come back to what we're going to discuss is this. Okay, continue reading.
ثم يرسل عليه
إليه
إليه
ملك
الملك فينفخ فيه روحا
الروح
ويؤمر
بأربع
كلمة
كلمات.
كلمات.
Okay. Okay, stop there. So I'll translate it. Now it's easy. This was the part that was tricky. So then the Prophet said, after that, then ثُمَّ يُرْسَلُ إِلَيْهِ الْمَلَكِ, then the angel is sent to that embryo. And فَيَنْفُخُ فِيهِ الرُّوحِ, and the angel breathes into that embryo the spirit, the soul, ruh. Okay? وَيُؤْمَرُ بِأَرْبَعِ كَلِمَاتٍ, and the angel is commanded with 4 things. Okay? And what are those 4 things? Read the Arabic. Okay, number 1, writes its provision. So we believe this is part of our belief. When human beings, prior to when they're born, the angel already comes down and Allah already knows what's going to happen, and the angel already writes 4 things. One of them is your provision, how much you're going to be earning in your entire life. Okay, so it's already written. What's the second thing? وَأَجَلِهِ. Ajalihi, ajal is the lifespan. It's already written down how long this baby is going to live in this world. It's all written. Okay? That's number 2. Number 3, وَعَمَلِهِ, and the actions that baby is going to perform in the world. So the provisions, that's monetary. The lifespan, how long he or she is going to live in this world. And then the actions that person is going to perform. And what's number 4? وَشَقِيٌّ Shaqiyun am sa'idun. Shaqi means unlucky, sa'id means happy. So the 4th thing is whether this person will be lucky or, and what does the translation say?
The translation says that his actions will be happy or unhappy.
Okay, Sa'id is happy, Shaqi, unhappy or unlucky. So what does that mean? That means whether that person is going to paradise or hellfire. Like the end result. So all this stuff is already written when the baby is still in that stage, when that life goes into the baby, that soul. Okay? So okay, and then the second half is should we discuss the second half? That's the famous part, okay. فَوَاللَّهِ الَّذِي لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا غَيْرُهُ إِنَّ أَحَدَكُمْ لَيَعْمَلُ بِعَمَلِ أَهْلِ الْجَنَّةِ حَتَّى مَا يَكُونَ بَيْنَهُ وَبَيْنَهَا إِلَّا ذِرَاعٌ فَيَسْبِقُ إِلَيْهِ الْكِتَابُ فَيَعْمَلُ بِعَمَلِ أَهْلِ النَّارِ فَيَدْخُلُهَا, in the converse. So the end is, by Allah, one of you might perform the deeds of the people of paradise until there's a handspan left between you and paradise, and that person performs a deed of the people of hellfire and will wind up in the hellfire. And then the opposite. Person might be performing the deeds of the people of fire until there's a handspan between that person and the fire, and then they perform the deeds of the people of paradise and they enter paradise. Okay. So the end part is trying to show you, the Prophet was trying to teach us that you don't know your end state, and no one should put in their mind, I'm a bad person, I'm never going to make it. Or I'm a good person, I already made it, right? So that means I already made it. When you have that mindset, you're going to slip and fall. And when you have that mindset that I'm bad, you're not going to do good. And you're going to just keep perpetuating that and live that life. So this is meant to inspire you. Look, the race isn't over till the end. The first half, yes, it's all written. But only Allah knows what's written. You're still responsible for your actions. So we still have to live this life as if, like, when we really don't know. So we have to give it our best effort and try to make it to paradise. So what I want to focus on the first part. So there's a couple things here. There's the Prophet is describing the stages of the embryo. And then there's the concept of after all of this, the angel comes, يَنْفُخُ فِيهِ الرُّوحِ. The ruh, the soul, comes into the body. So this is one thing called ensoulment. We can call it ensoulment. So there's embryology and then there's ensoulment, right? There's the stages of embryology and then the angel comes. So now, why is that important? That's important in fiqh, right? Because, and now even in America, there's an abortion debate, right? There's an abortion debate. And that abortion debate is basically there's half the country believes it's the woman's right to abort the fetus at any time she wishes, even a day before the baby is set to be born. And then there are others here that believe abortion is a crime and is equivalent to murder, and it's not allowed at any stage. So this idea of the ensoulment, that's where life begins. So that kind of has a bearing on the issue. So whenever you believe ensoulment happens, now that person has a soul. Now if that fetus has a soul and you abort that fetus, now that would be equivalent to taking a life, right? Because now life is there, or the soul is there at least. So this was one of the ways the jurists looked at whether abortion was allowed or not. So depending on how they viewed like this, when this happened, so when does this happen? And like at what stage in the pregnancy does ensoulment happen? And that, whatever you believe that point to be, based on that, scholars might have some views that, you know what, before ensoulment, you're allowed to do an abortion. And after there's a ruh, you're not allowed. That's for many scholars that allowed abortion, right? There were scholars that said, no, it's never allowed. And then there was a middle opinion that it's allowed when there's necessity, like if it endangers the life of a woman, or if there's exceptional circumstances like rape. So I'm not getting into that debate. There's a whole debate, but this is a hadith class. We're trying to share with you how an understanding of this hadith will lead to your position on this matter as a faqih, as a jurist. So this hadith, it says 40 days you're in the womb of your mother as a nutfa, then a similar period as a mudghah, as an alaqa, and then a similar period as a mudghah. So what's the similar period? 40, 40. What's 40 plus 40 plus 40? 120. Okay? So based on this hadith, where that was one of the evidences, the vast majority of Muslim scholars believe that the soul comes into the baby at 120 days. Because 40 days is a drop, 40 days as a clot, and then 40 days with the flesh of the embryo, right? So what trimester is 120 for the sisters? Like you have first, second, 120 days is like 4 months, right? So that's the second trimester, right? Okay. Um, okay. So now, why am I sharing this with you? Is there a problem here? Okay. So now, yes. Like sound.
This also gets to be a problem, even if it's not, I guess, aborted, meaning not living. But even once a baby passes, there's some that will say, yes, the baby still needs to be washed and shrouded and buried, or some just say straight buried. Some say washed, shrouded, buried, and prayed over and buried. So even this, it's not defined in regards to that.
Well, your understanding of this would impact that, right? So if there's ensoulment, if like that would be a miscarriage where it's not deliberate, but it just happened. If the miscarriage after 120 days, for the scholars that believe this is the time of ensoulment, now they believe there's a ruh, there's a soul in the baby. So now it would require all the things that a normal human being that dies, washing, shrouding, but then prior to 120 days, it would not because the ruh isn't there yet. So that would impact I'm not giving you the answer, I'm just telling you the same understanding would impact also that issue. That was good you brought that up. Not just about abortion, but also impact issues like the miscarriage. Do you have janazah? And do you wash? Do you bury? Do you pray? Janazah, yes, exactly. No, I haven't given you my understanding, so you need to be patient. There's a problem with this. So I'm telling you what the hadith in Arba'in says, right? So now, what does it say at the end of the hadith? Where is it related by? In the it says Rawahul Bukhari or Muslim. I haven't written. So again, Imam Nawawi, there's another hadith. He says it's in Bukhari and Muslim. Now this is a Bukhari class. Let's look it up. In the Arba'in says that? My Arba'in says Bukhari and Muslim.
On the app.
Okay, yeah, so that's not what Imam Nawawi wrote. Now, Imam Nawawi wrote Bukhari and Muslim. These guys corrected it. So, so, um, so that's good what they did, but it's also not good because now it shows you that you would read that and think Muslim wrote Nawawi wrote Rawahu Muslim, but Nawawi wrote Bukhari and Muslim, and in all the Arba'ins, the published copies, it says Bukhari and Muslim. So now let's look up Bukhari. We got 3 copies of Bukhari, the 3 different editions, all of them missing volume 1. Who took the volume 1? I mean, when you take a book, you got to put it back in the right spot. Now I need volume 1 to read the original. Oh, that's volume 1? Okay. Oh, that's yours. Okay, perfect. All right. So the hadith in Bukhari, it appears several times. It appears about 4 or 5 times, 4 times to be exact. First one is Kitab Bad al-Khalq. So let me try to find that for you. Where is the index here? Oh no, Kitab Bad al-Khalq is not in the beginning. It's Bad al-Khalq, not Bad al-Wahy. So I don't know what volume that's in. Let's see. It's not in volume 1. It is also in a few other chapters. Kitab Bad al-Khalq, Kitab Hadith al-Anbiya, Kitab al-Qadr, Kitab al-Tawheed. That would be towards the end. You have the entire Bukhari system? Or just this one? All right. Okay. It might be. Let's check. I think it's much later. What volume is that? That's one also? Okay. No, it's not this one either. It's probably like 7 or 8. I'm trying to find the exact volume that we could. They have all the volumes up there. Exactly. Okay, I went through all 7 volumes. It was the last one that I happened to check. That's subhanAllah. It's volume 4. Okay. Okay, who wants to read? Where did Najib go? I was gonna ask. Hey, okay. You're gonna read the hadith. Let's switch it up. Yeah. This is the hadith right here. Both. So we're gonna read, so Sahih Bukhari has this hadith 4 times. So we're gonna see what Bukhari actually says. Okay. So read the Arabic, yes.
حدثنا حسن بن ربيع
Okay.
حدثنا أبو الأحوص عن الأعمش عن زيد بن وهب قال عبد الله حدثنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وهو صادق والمصدوق قال إن أحدكم يجمع خلقه في بطن أمه 40 يوما ثم يكون علقة مثل ذلك ثم يكون مضغة مثل ذلك ثم يبعث الله ملك ويؤمر بأربع كلمات.
Okay, that's good. So now read the English, so that part.
That part?
Yeah, verily you shall be, or
إن أحدكم. Okay. Something.
you can see what. Read from the beginning.
Okay.
Read the English from the beginning, no problem.
Narrated Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu, Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the true and truly inspired, said, the matter of the creation of a human being is put together in the womb of the mother in 40 days. And then he becomes a clot of thick blood for a similar period, and then a piece of flesh for a similar period. Then Allah sends an angel who is ordered to write 4 things.
Okay, that's good. So, I know we don't have the hadith in front of us, but just there are some differences here. So this hadith, first of all, it says, you shall be brought, inna ahadakum yujma'u khalquhu fi batni ummihi. So the beginning is the same. You shall be brought in the womb of your mother for 40 days. But it doesn't say as a nutfa. So this hadith, in Bukhari, it says 40 days. You shall be brought in the womb of your mother for 40 days. But it doesn't specify as a drop, as a nutfa. But then it says after that, it says, ثُمَّ يَكُونُ عَلَقَةً مِثْلَ ذَلِكَ. Does it say nutfa or alaqa first?
This alaqa.
Alaqa, so there's no nutfa. So it says, and then there is alaqa for a similar period. Okay? Alaqa for a similar period. And then mudgha for a similar period. So that translation, it says, مثل ذلك. يعني ثم يكون علقة مثل ذلك. مضغة مثل ذلك. Like that. It really says like that. So that's a mistranslation. But there's a difference here. So there's no mention of nutfa as 40. This one is very clear. 40 days as a nutfa, 40 days as an alaqa, 40 days as a mudgha. This one says you're brought in the womb of your mother for 40 days. In that period, you are an alaqa, mithla like that, and a mudgha like that. So it says something slightly different. So what does that mean? Now, early scholars didn't really make a big deal of it, right? Because this is before science and embryology. And so they read it like this. So they believe 40 as this, 40 as this, 40 as this, and 120. Total 120, and that's where the soul comes in. Okay? But now in embryology, what do we know? In embryology, we know like there's the stages of embryology. This is science and medicine. Is it 120 days where the baby's fully formed? That's like the second trimester. If you have a miscarriage in the first trimester, like early on, do you see a baby? First trimester. Any sisters know? I mean, I'm not talking about the beginning, towards the end of the first trimester. Let's say at the end of the 3rd month. That's still prior to 120 days. Do you have like body parts? Anyone know? No, in embryology, what we know is that, No, the clot is only for like a week. It's a full baby. No, yeah, but we're talking about generally speaking. No, what does the embryo look like, generally speaking? Yes. So, I mean, embryology, we know all this stuff happens very early. There's fertilization, right? In 1 week, there's implantation. In 21 days, the first heartbeat. 21 days is within the first 40 days, you already have a beating heart. What is that? Okay. No, okay, so 21 days, you already have a beating heart. So nutfa is just sperm, like a drop of fluid. Alaqa, that fluid clings. It's just like a cell. Mudgha, it starts looking like flesh. If this happens 120 days, modern embryo, we know in 20 days you already have organs. You already have a beating heart. So it's all very early. By 8 weeks, you have all the organs. 8 weeks is the first 2 months. All the organs are there. So this doesn't correspond to embryology, 120 days. So there's some milestones, 21 days, first heartbeat. The movements start at 120 days. That's where the baby actually starts kicking around. That's 120 days. But you have within hours, when conception happens, within hours, you have all this happening already. And pretty much 8 weeks, all the organs are formed. So roughly speaking, all this happens in 40 days already. All 3 stages. And the hadith in Bukhari doesn't say 40 days nutfa, 40 days alaqa, 40 days mudgha. It says you're brought in the womb of your mother for 40 days, and in that period, you have, it doesn't mention nutfa, but it's understood. You have alaqa and you have mudgha within that 40 days. That's what this hadith says. Or that's one way of understanding this hadith. And there's another version of the hadith in Muslim. It says it all takes place in 40 days. So according to this, ensoulment, according to this understanding of the hadith, as the way it's actually in Bukhari, ensoulment should be, or it should be after 40 days, not 120. I mean, that's an understanding. We don't know exactly when the soul gets breathed in, but the hadith indicates after all this happens, an angel is sent. So if you understood this hadith the way Imam Nawawi related it, you would understand 40 days of each. And then 120 days, that's where the soul comes in. And then you might say, well, okay, now prior to 120 days, you can have an abortion, or you might not need to do the janazah, or all sorts of rulings that come from that. But from modern embryology, we know this is not the case. It cannot be 120. 120 days is advanced. Already by the first 40 days, you have a baby. So that's why if you look at Bukhari itself, it doesn't say 40, then 40, then 40. So Bukhari's hadith doesn't support 120 days. And you could stretch that hadith to think that it means mithla dhalik is 40, 40, 40, but the right understanding, if you put them all together, if you look at all the hadith in Bukhari and Muslim, doesn't say this. Neither Muslim. It says 40 days, and within that period, you're brought as an alaqa, mudgha, and prior to that, a nutfa. So, according to the hadith, looks like, and now modern scholars that look at it and they know science, they understand, well, this is a huge mistake. So what is the mistake? This one word was a mistake. Arba'ina yawman nutfatan, thumma alaqatan mithla dhalik. When scholars somebody put that word in there, nutfa, 40 days as a nutfa, then alaqa for a similar period, then mudgha for a similar period. But the hadith doesn't say 40 days as a nutfa. It just says 40 days. And in that period, you have nutfa, alaqa, mudgha. So the entire thing takes place in 40 days. Okay? So, what's the take home? I mean, we'll talk about the embryology, but the take home lesson is another example where Imam Nawawi misquoted Bukhari and Muslim. Not a major mistake. He's still a great scholar. Just showing you as a hadith student, you've got to read the original. The original does not say nutfatan. And you can search. It appears 4 times in Bukhari, this hadith. And in Muslim also, this hadith is there. And nowhere it says 40 days as a nutfa. Muslim says, Inna ahadakum yujma'u khalquhu fi batni ummihi arba'ina yawman, period. ثُمَّ يَكُونُ فِي ذَلِكَ عَلَقَةً مِثْلَ ذَلِكَ. So Muslim's hadith says, you shall be brought in the womb of your mother for 40 days. then fi dhalika, within that period, you will be alaqa, like that, and then mudgha, like that. So it's very clear. It's within that whole period all this happens. And the hadith in Muslim makes it clear, and even Bukhari suggests that. So it's actually a mistake that happened in the Arba'in, that happened in many, so when people quote the hadith, sometimes they'll put an extra word, and that creates this understanding of 120, which doesn't correspond with embryology or modern science. But if you look, so my point to you is, these mistakes happen, but they don't happen by Bukhari. This is the Bukhari. I need you to appreciate, like, even though it's in the Arba'in, it's a mistake Imam Nawawi made. It's a mistake many scholars made, telling you that it's 40 days nutfa, 40 days alaq, 40 days mudgha. Therefore, the soul comes in, and soulment happens at 120 days. But that's a mistaken understanding. So actually, the whole process of embryology that's alluded to here takes place within 40 days. So according to that, after the 40 days, the angel would come, and at some point breathe the soul in. So now, if you bring this understanding, you might think, okay, 40 days, prior to 40 days, you can have an abortion, but after 40 days, you cannot. And after 40 days, if you have a miscarriage on day 41, you would have to pray janazah. See how different the understanding is? So there's an article, last thing I'll say, Sheikh Hatem al-Hajj wrote an article on this recently, and he shared it on his Facebook last week, a couple of days ago, but he's going with the majority position, and his argument is that, well, the angel gets sent after this, but we don't know how long after this. So it doesn't have to be immediate, but it might be the case, all this happens at 40 days, but still the angel would come at 120 days. So he's still going with the majority position. I didn't find that so convincing. But if you look at the point being, don't even rely on Imam Nawawi to read a hadith of Bukhari. You have to go to the original. It makes a huge difference in your understanding of things. Okay? So with that, we'll take the floor for questions. Yes, Sheikh.
For clarity's sake, when you say the original, are you talking about the manuscript, or are you just talking?
No, I just mean Bukhari itself.
Okay.
It could be a published edition.
Okay.
Like, if you read even these are published. In Bukhari, it doesn't have nutfa. So this word isn't there in any of the books of hadith for some reason. How did Imam Nawawi insert it in there? A lot of the later scholars started inserting that word in there. Probably what happened is, my feeling is, because the fuqaha already had this view, 40 days, 40 days, 40 days, 120. So they back projected that in the hadith, and later scholars, when they're writing, they just put like a clarification. You're brought in the womb of your mother for 40 days, parentheses, as a nutfa. It was added in there to make the hadith make sense, but it was a huge mistake. Now we know it didn't make sense in that understanding. Rather, that word was a mistake. Just one word made a mistake. Okay, some sisters had questions. No? Okay. No. There's another hadith, or there's some other hadith that there are other hadith on the issue that support one or the other, but these are the strong hadith, Bukhari and Muslim. They have this. So it kind of, when you look at it and thinking back, it's pretty clear. It's 40 days, the whole process. That's the proper hadith analysis. This understanding was a later understanding that kind of crept into that. So Sheikh Hatem is saying you could still believe 120 days is installment while believing this hadith. Yes.
Abu Zayd, does Dr. Hatem's comments stay on Facebook or his regular?
His regular Facebook. He linked it to an article he wrote for a journal. So it's a nice article. It's very brilliant. I read it last week. So it's a detailed article. I'm just sharing with you the conclusion. He still believes we should go with the majority. He's a faqih, so
Could
he
you
sometimes.
write his name on the board for all of us that don't know him?
Dr. Hatem Al-Haj, he's a jurist and a medical doctor. He writes a lot. He's well known to the community. But he wrote an article on that. He didn't talk about this hadith issue. This is me dissecting it. He kind of alluded to it in a sentence, I think. But he has an article on this whole fiqh understanding. Yes, sister.
Would you go into the understanding that no matter what, after 120th day, then the baby would have to be washed, shrouded, and prayed over?
No, I'm telling you, the right understanding is probably 40 days. 120 was a mistake. Probably 40 days is safe for one, and that's what the hadith says. So after 40 days, you should probably do the janazah if any miscarriage happens after 40.
But definitely, if a person came to you and said the person's 5 months, you would have definitely have done it.
Yeah,
Okay, that's.
yeah.
What does this doctor?
Yeah, let me finish with the sisters and I'll come
I'm
back.
saying, what does this doctor support? Did you tell us?
What is what?
What is this doctor that you gave us? What is his?
He's saying, what does Dr. Hatem support?
He supports 120 days, but I disagree with him.
I just want to know what this is.
But I mean, you have to make up your mind. Like you guys have to make. But I'm sharing with you the hadith evidence. So that hadith is a mistake. That word is a mistake. It's not there in any of the books of hadith. But Imam Nawawi put it in there. Is he the first one to do it? I'm not sure. You have to. I don't know where did the mistake happen. Who started putting? Started happening much later. All the early books of hadith don't have the word nutfatan, right? Oh, yes, Quran. Okay, let's look up the verses of Quran. This is a good idea. Always help, let the
Assalamu
Quran.
alaikum. What about the nukfa in the Quran?
Yeah, Bismillah. This is an old book, Human Development as Described in the Quran and Sunnah, by Mustafa Ahmed and others, Keith Moore. So this was published a long time ago. It's a collection of articles. But it shares some verses. So there's a verse in Surah Al-Mu'minun, verse number 12 to 14. وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِنْ طِينٍ ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاهُ نُطْفَةً فِي قَرَارٍ مَكِينٍ ثُمَّ خَلَقْنَا النُّطْفَةَ عَلَقَةً فَخَلَقْنَا الْعَلَقَةَ مُضْغَةً فَخَلَقْنَا الْمُضْغَةَ عِظَامًا فَكَسَوْنَا الْعِظَامَ لَحْمًا ثم أنشأناه خلقا آخر فتبارك الله أحسن الخالقين. This is one of the verses. There are many verses in the Quran speaking about these stages. So some of them are in detail, some of them are shorter. This verse is a little bit of detail. So the translation is, verily we have created man from a quintessence of clay. سُلَالَةٍ مِنْ طِينٍ ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاهُ نُطْفَةً. Then we placed him as a drop in a place of settlement. That's the womb of the mother. So a drop, nutfa. Okay? And then thumma, we made that nutfa a alaqa, which is like a leaf-like structure or like a clot, something that clings. And then فَخَلَقْنَا الْعَلَقَةَ مُضْغَةً. Then we made that alaqa into a mudgha. And mudgha is a chewed up piece of flesh. Okay? And then we placed skeleton and bones and flesh around that embryo. And then we brought an entirely different creation. And glory be to a blessed is Allah, the best to create. That's one verse. So even in the verse, you have nutfa, alaqa, mudgha. But prior to nutfa, in this verse talks about the clay, the origin of human beings.
You still have to come back to the Sunnah for the understanding of it.
Yes. In Surah Al-Qiyamah, Allah says, أَلَمْ يَكُنْ نُطْفَةً مِّن مَنِيٍّ يُمْنَى. Was he not a drop of germinal fluid emitted? Talking about human beings that are arrogant. Just remember your origin. You were a nutfa, just a piece of a drop of semen, right? So that's a very humble origin. Allah reminds us of that. Anyone who thinks they're haughty, that's where you began, right? There are a few other verses. Allah says in Surah Al-Zumar, يَخْلُقُكُمْ فِي بُطُونِ أُمَّهَاتِكُمْ خَلْقًا مِّن بَعْدِ خَلْقٍ فِي ظُلُمَاتٍ ثَلَاثٍ. He is the one who made you, created you in the wombs of your mothers in stage after stage, in 3 layers of darkness. So stage after stage, it's not telling you the stages, but stage after stage, giving you an idea that there are stages. And 3 levels of darkness. Could be nutfa, alaqa, mudgha, or it could be the placental sac, the uterus, and then the amniotic sac. So there are a lot of verses that speak about this, but the general theme in the verses is nutfa, alaqa, mudgha. And after mudgha, the bones and everything come in. So Shaykh Hatim says, well, this idea at the end of the verse, it says, and then we brought forth an entirely new creation. أَنْشَأْنَاهُ خَلْقًا آخَرَ insha. It could be that after all this happens, then the soul comes in. Maybe this portion of the verse is speaking about the ensoulment. And he says, we know it happens after these stages, but it doesn't say when. It could be immediately after, or it could be a lot after. So even if you believe in 40 days, still could be possible that 120 days is when the soul comes in. But I mean, I believe it sounds like that's stretching it a bit, just to support the majority opinion, but Allahu A'lam. I mean, that's something you guys have to make up your mind. My job here is to teach you that their mistakes happen in, like, when you read secondary sources, even something as great as the Arba'in of Imam Nawawi. Okay. Yes, no, Najib.
I have 2 questions. Modern day scholars, the general consensus, I would say, or the majority opinion, I know these words are loaded, but what still holds that 120 days is the period of the creation or the development of the embryo. Is that true? Does the majority of scholars still cling to that 120?
What's your second question?
All right, second
That's
question.
a deep one.
Yeah. My second question is, what is my second question?
All right, let's take that. That'll come back to you. So that's a good question. So what do majority of scholars or jurists today, the fuqaha, say about ensoulment? The vast majority believe in 120. And so even some of them say there's consensus, but there's no such thing as consensus. I mean, it's better to say majority. Consensus is impossible. Consensus means everyone in the world agrees. And that never happens. That only happened in time of the companions. So I don't believe there's any ijma' after the era of the companions. So even Shaykh Hatim kind of admits, he says the consensus is 120 days, but then he admits, okay, it's not an absolute consensus. There were always scholars from the early time that believed it was 40 days. So he says it's kind of like a metaphorical consensus. He calls it ijma' sukuti. It's a tacit consensus. So at the end of the day, majority of fuqaha from different schools, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanafi, majority of them believe 120 days even today. Okay. So if you're a believer of the schools and you believe in the majority and you want to go with the institution, 120 days, that's what Shaykh Hatim defends. But if you're more free, like some of us, and you want to look at the evidences kind of support this. So Shaykh Zarabozo in his commentary, the 40 Hadith, he believes it's 40 days. And he believes that's just a mistake. And as far as the 4 schools of thought, he doesn't care. So that's one approach, like, they could be wrong, right? So Shaykh Hatim defends the majority. I didn't find it so convincing because he kind of says, well, the consensus was 120 and they must have had some proof. We don't know what that proof is, but it must have been there. So if you follow that approach, then, I mean, that's a valid approach. I respect you if you do that, but I mean, we need proof at the end of the day. So this hadith doesn't stand because it's a mistake. So you can't quote this. They used to quote this hadith as a proof. But now we see that it's a mistake, so you can't quote that anymore. So at the end of the day, you're left with, are you just going to go with the majority? I mean, that's a valid approach. Because you have trust in them. Sheikh Hatem has trust in the majority. He says they must know what they're talking about. You might not know their proof. Maybe it's not knowable today, but
Wait,
you know.
so under that,
But I mean, I don't follow. I mean, I
Right.
believe you need to have evidences. You need to have
Right,
proof.
right.
You need to have verses of Quran, sound hadith. So you're always gonna. So you need to understand. There are always going to be these two approaches. You need to respect everyone. There are people that will use the lens of the four schools to understand Islam, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. And there are others like us, like myself. We don't necessarily confine ourselves to the four schools, and we look at evidences. Right? So there's always these two approaches. Respect all of them. Like, I don't like when people who follow schools, they're always, denigrating those who don't follow the schools. You don't know what you're talking about. Do you know better than Imam Shafi and so on and so forth. That's not healthy. And similarly, it's not healthy from this side. These people consider all of them to be mistaken, and they have no basis. They don't follow Quran and Sunnah. Of course, they were following Quran and Sunnah. But this is a complex enterprise. Let's respect different approaches. There's always going to be different approaches at the end of the day. You're going to have to follow your own approach and create your own approach. But these approaches will always be there. We have to respect them.
Second question, in
Yes.
terms of hadith. So what would you suggest to the lay people like us who we have a culture of quoting hadith, this hadith says this, and then we see things like this we totally unaware of, but we stand by the hadith and we don't have any real training, but we say, this is what the hadith say, this is what the hadith say, and then we studying in this class, look at this, you see how complicated this is. Not as easy as just saying hadith, because you can lead people astray.
Yes.
So this is like, how do we maintain that balance between, we Ahlul Sunnah, we believe in hadith, but also like being very cautious when we just saying the hadith say this and this is the hadith and that's it. Are you people like, what was your recommendation for us to be able to navigate like these things?
I mean, that's a deep point. I mean, just quoting hadith or quoting books, there are mistakes that happen. And this is a mistake in Arba'in from Imam Nawawi himself in the hadith. So that's a difficult one. I mean, we need to read Quran and Sunnah, but at the same time, you need to understand this knowledge is deep. It's not superficial. It's not that easy. And you can't just open a book and quote it. You might be misquoting something, and the book might have a mistake from the author. So, at the end of the day, what you need is a lot of humility, a lot of humbleness. Don't go around thinking you know everything. Even when you learn something, teach it with some humility, because you could be wrong. If you have a little bit of humility and willingness to hear everyone out, and willingness to study with all types of people, then I think you'll be kind of safe. So that's a good approach. Okay. Yes, Mother Mustafa.
Abu Zayd, I just gotta go to this ayat in the Quran, in chapter 7, verse number 147.
Okay.
That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, what constitutes the English. He says, I will keep distracted from my signs those who behave arrogantly on earth without any right, and who, when if they see every sign, will not believe in them. They will not take the way of right guidance if they see it, but will take the way of error if they see that. That's because they denied our signs and paid them no heed. What I was thinking about was some of the narrations that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when the man asked, when he spoke to Hudayfa and Hudayfa asked him about the bad times to come. He said, were there any? In one particular narration, he said, he said, head for the hills and eat from the roots of trees until death consume you. In another narration, he said, stick to the jama'ah. And when you were just talking about, it made me think about, well, okay, I've always accepted the four schools as that particular boundary, but then again, the point that he brings out, is a valid point. Well, like, what about Allah gives him who He pleases? And the Prophet says, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in every 100 years, He would send a mujaddid.
Mujaddid, yeah.
Mujaddid.
Yeah, I mean, so So to be honest, this is a problem of the fiqh people that messed up the hadith. So this is where the schools of thought had this opinion, and they back projected that opinion, put that word in the hadith. But the hadith for Bukhari and Muslim was clear. So it goes both ways. They're hadith folk that take individual hadith and they use that against the fiqh guys, right? And then because they don't have a broader understanding, that's a superficial understanding. But then there's also the problem of people of the schools of thought, because you're accustomed to thinking a certain way, and then if mistakes happen, you won't acknowledge them. And then, to be honest, how did this mistake happen? Probably because Imam Nawawi is a faqih. He's a Shafi'i faqih. So his understanding is clear. It's 120 days. So he's reading this hadith. I mean, if we assume that he's the one who put that word there, it could be someone before him did that. But someone before him, the same thing would apply. They already believe it's 120 days. So they're reading the hadith, they're writing the hadith, and they say, you know what, the Prophet meant nutfatan. So they'll put that word there, but they meant it as parentheses. So they're not misquoting, they just clarifying. That's called idraj, where you clarify a part of the hadith, and that clarification becomes part of the hadith. And then the early students might know the difference. That was a comment of the teacher. But later on, they're like, people forget that, and it becomes quoted as part of the hadith. So this is, if we believe in 40 days, this would be a case where the fiqh opinion was wrong, but it got back projected into the hadith. The hadith became something that supported 120 days, a circular thing, right? So if that theory is solid, that's what I'm inclining towards right now. But it could be, more evidence comes later and we realize, well, there was maybe something else that supported the 120 days. In any case, that's a mistake, right? Where did the mistake originate? Allahu A'lam. Yes, brother in the back.
Now, Muslim countries that's doing practicing the Sharia, what would they go by? Like Saudi, for example,
Like in what issue?
or Iraq, huh?
What would they go by in what? Like,
As far as like abortions,
oh, I don't know. I'm not an expert on. I have
As
no idea.
far as the
First of
law-
all, Sharia in the world is only maybe 2 countries.
okay,
There's hardly any country that practice Sharia, and the ones that do it, it's very selective. They only do it when it suits them. So
Okay.
there's no truly Muslim state that practices Sharia today. So there are states that have Sharia as part of their code that they rely on, like Saudi Arabia, maybe the island of Brunei, they recently passed. But even those countries, they have, so what is their position? I believe the Hanbali position is, so Saudi Arabia, they usually follow the Hanbali position. And I think Hanbali position implies like 40 days. It's closer to the 40 days. So it would depend on the individual judge who's ruling, the qadi. He might be following the 40-day opinion, which is, there's a Hanbali position of 40. But in Hanbali school, you have a lot of positions all over the place. So there might be some that follow the majority and say 120 as well. So Sheikh Hatim quotes the Hanbali position as being abortion is permissible during the first 40 days only, based upon need. So that's Hanbali. Malikis were the strictest, and there it's impermissible in all circumstances, and I like that one. Like 40 versus 120, it doesn't matter. You can't abort. That's like taking away, even if the soul didn't come in, is going to come in. So at some point, it's still alive, right? The fetus might not be a person. So abortion should not be allowed in any state. That's the Maliki position. Hanafi school is 120 days. Prior to that, it's allowed based upon certain criteria. I mean, no one says allowed all the time. Some of them say it's allowed based on health. Some of them say it's allowed based upon necessity. And very few would say it's absolutely allowed. But the Maliki generally said no, it's never allowed.
I have
Okay.
another question.
Yes.
This question is arising from the kind of discussion that we're having. What would the jurors say from your reading about a baby that is diagnosed with a condition? Maybe you could foresee a special needs condition. Although only Allah knows with certainty how the baby's going to be born. But if doctors foresee this person may have a mental disability, this baby, or foresee things of that nature, which may not be life threatening, but could be impairing.
So that would be falling. So
How would they say that with abortion? Is that like too speculative? Because we don't know, or
no,
is
it's
it
not speculative anymore. So now, this idea of fetal deformities, right? Like now we can detect sometimes Down syndrome and things like that, or other more serious things where we know this baby is going to have major complications like fetal deformities, and so that would be a modern fiqh issue. Like in the past, you had no way of knowing these things. So Sheikh Hatem references a lot of the modern fiqh councils. They're looking at this issue, and he shares some views of theirs. He says abortion in the first 40 days is allowed with certain justifications. You have sound justifications. But then, and what are those justifications? It could be rape, it could be some other things. But then he says in the intermediate term, so the first 40 days is more flexible. That's what he's trying to say. The first 40 days is pretty clear that ensoulment hasn't happened. So here there's more flexibility to allow abortion based upon certain criteria. But then in the intermediate, what about between 40 and 120? So he says now, so the modern fiqh councils, they're looking at it, they know there's a difference of opinion. They're saying the first 40, everyone agrees there's no soul. So it's a little more flexible. And now between 40 and 120 is in an intermediate range. So he says, he quoted one of the fiqh council, they said, in this period between 40 and 120, abortion would be permitted in case of rape for this particular council, or major fetal deformity that would be incompatible with dignified life. So it would have to be, it wouldn't be, like it probably wouldn't be Down syndrome, because Down syndrome, you can still have a normal life, relatively speaking. It would be some major syndrome where, you know, there are some really terrible syndromes out there, Allah protect us. There are things where you just can't form skin, and the baby is not going to survive more than a couple months to a couple of years, and it's a very miserable life. So if there's syndromes like that that are not compatible with dignified life, then 40 to 120, a lot of scholars would allow. And then after 120, this council said that after 120 days, it's more strict. So it would only be allowed if the mother's life is in danger or her health is in real danger. So if like carrying the baby to term would lead to like catastrophic consequences for the mother, then it can be allowed at any stage, right? That's a health consequence, yes.
Abu Zayd, can you share with the class the conversation that you and I had? I was telling you that someone had told me that you don't like to deal with the fiqh issues per se in general, and that you didn't want to teach fiqh. And you said, yeah.
I mean, that's a personal thing. That's not really, I mean, I'm not a fiqh person, and I would never, because I haven't studied the four schools, I respect them. I mean, I'm into Quran, Qira'at, Hadith, and I know my lane, so I don't go out there and give fatwas and things like that. I think it's just very tricky. I have a whole discomfort with this whole thing. Like, so this whole modern first 40 is more strict, 40 to 120 is intermediate, 120 onwards, absolute need. I mean, at one level, it's very arbitrary. It's just, I believe you should pick a position you think is right and stick with that instead of like trying to accommodate everyone. There's this thing of trying to accommodate everyone. That's what fiqh does. Like jurists, they're trying to help you live in this world, and they have to be pragmatic. So they try to accommodate everyone, and then so generally you'll find fuqaha don't like to rock the boat. Fuqaha don't like to come up with revolutionary positions. They like to support and let people live to the best of their ability in the circumstances they're given. Sometimes I'm a revolutionary. Sometimes you need revolution. Sometimes things are so bad you can't. So like every situation in our life in the ummah, things were bad. Look at, like the transatlantic slave trade. There were fuqaha justifying, people being snatched up from the African continent and just, so there, because that was the situation, that was the status quo. But, a lot of them weren't looking at, but there were great states in West Africa that took up jihad. They said, no matter what, this is not right. Now, there were fuqaha justifying that, slavery is part of like the tradition and things like that. When Andalus fell, fuqaha were justifying that. When the Mongols came, but there's always these revolutionaries. Maybe that's not the right term. The right term is mujaddid. What is a mujaddid that Mustafa alluded to? Allah says every 100 years He will send people who will rock the boat. Mujaddid is people who say, wait a minute, all you scholars, everyone doing this, something's not right. We need a radical shift. So the mujaddideen, they radically shift things. And they bring people, and what they're trying to do is bring the deen back. But you have to do that by rocking the boat. If you do that by respecting every opinion, and just these are all the opinions, pick and choose, then you're not rocking the boat. You can't change your circumstances. So we need this too. We need fuqaha. We need people to help us live, and we need pragmatic scholars. But we also need people that rock the boat. So I'm on that side. Yes, there were sisters that had a question? Okay. Yeah.
So one thing that you're teaching us is just to see the difference of how Imam Bukhari, and he went further and made sure in depth. For us, as the brother asked, laymen who can read maybe even Arabic but not be able to, define it and everything else, what would you suggest for us in a situation like this? Maybe to have an imam that we respect their knowledge and their wisdom and go on to what they're saying, or when we see this, how do we know when we're faced with this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So of course, everyone needs to have a mentor, imam, and a scholar. So you always have to have someone that you trust, that helps guide you. So in this whole issue, if you're dealing with a practical thing like abortion, miscarriage, or fetal deformity, that you need a good imam and scholar to help you guide through that. So, but at the stage of being a student, I'm trying to give you some tools. One of the tools is read Bukhari yourself. I mean, don't make judgments or verdicts based on that, but read it. So, like, if you were to read Bukhari, like on this hadith, you'll find it doesn't say that. So, but you have to read the Arabic and English together, and you'll find it doesn't say blood clot. So you can start thinking. As students, always think. So you might not have all the answers, but always think. Read and think and question things. Don't be afraid to do that. That's the best thing you can do. So when you read, you think, you come up with questions. Sometimes the answers will come to you. Sometimes you'll ask someone to get the answers. But always be critical. If you're not critical, you would read Nawawi and think this is what the hadith says, end of story. You won't know about this whole debate. You'll say, well, the hadith is pretty clear. 40 days as a nutfa, but you need to be thinking. Read original. So my advice to you is original sources. Like read the original books rather than secondary books. That's one. And number two, think a lot critically. Try to reflect and think and ask questions. And the last thing would be having an imam or a scholar or a guide that you're always conversating with, inshallah.
Jose, just wanted to let you know that your student, the attorney here, came late, and he's over
Yeah,
there.
I saw him walk in.
Okay.
I can see, because I can see. That's what they all say. Alhamdulillah.
Yes, I would like to mention that 1972 to now,
That's the year I was born.
really, Alhamdulillah. From 1972 until now, they have killed 13 million black babies in the abortion clinic. I was shocked when I heard this information. Then the other information I read, that the majority of the abortion clinics are in the black
Inner
community.
cities, yeah.
So we being exterminated and don't even know it.
Yeah.
So please, and sisters, please, let's teach our children, especially the girls, not to have an abortion. And you mentioned before and after, in other words,
So,
after.
I mean, I don't, that's the position of many scholars, but I think we should be Malikis. It should never be allowed. I mean, like I said, that's not my position, that's the position of some scholars. But like, you don't have to wait till the soul comes in to consider it a human being. It's still going to be a human being.
Yes.
It doesn't make sense in any stage. That's a good position to have.
Yes, thank you very much
Yeah.
for that.
I'm sorry, it seems like I'm always hogging the mic, so I
No,
apologize.
no problem.
Okay. All right, so the fuqaha, or the jurists, the legal scholars, right? For example, he mentioned in our communities, this, I never heard the statistics, but I'm gonna be wild. So are we to consider, like, even if this is allowed within 40, 120 days, for example, generally speaking, people, the jurists allow this, but are we to take into account facts on the ground? So if we know, for example, if I'm a legal scholar and the jurists say this is the position, but as a scholar in my community, I know what's happening in my community, is there any mechanism where the scholars say, no, this is haram in this community? Particularly, only in this community is not allowed. I mean, thinking pragmatically, knowing these facts and seeing the outcome, like, it's just a lot to think about when we think about just not the text, but the reality of the people's living.
That's what fiqh is supposed to be. It's supposed to be recognizing the reality on the ground and these extra circumstances, not just from books. So real fuqaha are supposed to do that. But the problem happens is that, you have scholars across the world that people go to them with questions, and then they answer a question, then it gets brought here without understanding the reality on the ground. And that's a huge problem. So that's a problem with, so a lot of these scholars in these fiqh councils in the Middle East, they're dealing with the situation. They're not having this issue with mass abortion. They're dealing with situations where there are syndromes. There are some women that have syndromes, and they're going to have, so that's primarily where they're coming from, where children are being born with certain defects, like in Iraq, for instance, with all the bombardment we did, all these birth defects, right? So a scholar there will be thinking about it from that perspective and give a different judgment. But like the brother mentioned, there are real stats on the ground. That's why you need a scholar that's local. I mean, we still respect scholars overseas, but you need scholars that are local, that understand the facts on the ground. And the other thing, I don't have a lot of respect for scholars that people come with questions and they ask them a simple question and they just pronounce a verdict. How are you going to do that without listening to the other side? That's what causes all this fitna in the community. What kind of scholar just hears one perspective and pronounces judgment and tells people, this is what's going on, be warned of this person? That is not justice. So like, real scholars don't do that. Real scholars, they should refuse to answer until they hear all the sides, and they should look at the facts on the ground. And that's why you need a local scholar. You shouldn't have someone on phone from another country that you're calling for your question. You could ask theoretical questions about hadith and stuff like that, but like what's happening on the ground, you need local scholars that are aware of that. Every community needs to have its own scholars. And a lot of scholars who are not from the African American community, they don't understand the dynamics of minorities in America at all. So like, they'll answer questions that don't even it shows they don't have the basic understanding of things. So you need your own scholars, while respecting everyone else in the spirit of respect, but you still need your own scholars from your communities. And then you need to invest in your youth. You need to have your children go and study and come back to your communities, to bring that knowledge here, and they would know better how to apply that here than someone else. Allahu A'lam.
Assalamu alaikum. You said basically what I was about to say. Two things as I see the answer. The brother has a lot of information and has been giving information for many years, but we don't read as a community as much as we should and teach as much as we should. So I think that would be the answer, having more classes like this, as simple as this one hadith is, but it just gets you to think. And this is across the board, you know, not only our children, but as adults, we don't think. And as you said, those should be the three things: the source, the main source, and not all these other people who are not part of our community or don't understand our experience give us or give answers to questions that really do not apply to us. So more reading, and to you just personally, thank you.
Barakallah.
Abu Zaid, can I just make one announcement too? And I'd like to see all of us that are here, in particular, we've asked Dr. Hatem to come and to put our masjid on his radar next to come and teach a class in fiqh. And he assured me that he would. So I'm just saying to all of us, inshallah, let's try to stay together as students of knowledge, so that when he comes, we can welcome him not with just one person or two people or something like that, inshallah. The next question is here.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Alaikum.
You know, the Prophet ﷺ said that the best of his people will be three, his companions, the tabi'un. So he said after that point, there'll be itilaf. And I'm thinking, is it ijma, a consensus of how we do things like, for instance, salat? Pray as you see me pray. So we do what the Prophet ﷺ often did, not what he just generally did. Is that true? With the consensus, I'm saying.
Okay, there's two things. Yeah, we're supposed to do what the Prophet, his sunnah. We're supposed to follow his sunnah, which is his normative practice. That's the word. Not what he did on occasion. It could have been like an exceptional thing.
No.
So like an example would be Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman. He says that I was walking with the Prophet ﷺ, and he went to the outskirts of the city and he urinated standing up. That's a hadith. So based on that hadith, can I go around and start a campaign in every masjid? Brothers, urinate standing up. That's the sunnah. The Prophet did. Is a hadith. Let's everyone follow the sunnah and start urinating standing up. What would you feel about that? No. Why? Because that was one time the Prophet did that. But it was Aisha radiallahu anha, she said in another hadith that he never urinated standing up. Whoever says that doesn't know what they're talking about.
Why?
So how do you understand that whole situation? We understand that the Prophet's sunnah was always to urinate sitting down. But on occasion, like if there's something going on that would warrant that, he did it once, maybe twice. So it's allowed to do that in certain situations, but that's not the norm, that's not the sunnah.
No.
So we as Muslims, we need to follow the sunnah, the guidance, the norm, right? On every issue. And then the consensus, okay, you have the sunnah?
No, go ahead, I'm listening.
The consensus is, I don't believe in consensus. I have a little, like, there's no such thing as consensus. Like, do you have consensus between all your masjids on Eid or on Taraweeh, on anything? We can't get together on any issue. And it's been like that for the whole ummah. So there's never been a case where you have absolute consensus. Ijma' means absolute consensus. When all the Muslim scholars agree on something, it becomes a matter of law. But that's never been the case. So it's a theoretical thing. It doesn't really exist. It only exists in times of Sahaba. So if Umar radiallahu anhu, when he was a Khalifa, did something, he had his council of major companions present. No one dissented. That's ijma'. But after the companions, there's no such thing. But we talk about it a lot, consensus. But what we really mean, the proper term is to have as much agreement as possible, to have like as broad consensus, but it's not really ijma'. You have to recognize that. So it's better when there's 100 scholars agree with something. Of course, that position is stronger than if one scholar. But don't call it ijma', because if you call it ijma', that means it's part of Sharia, it's binding. This has the same level as like Quran. And there never was ijma' on any issue except in the time of the companions.
Yes, you mentioned that you was a doctor, I have a question for you. The Caesarean section saying that
Cesarean section?
yes,
Okay.
said a woman can only have 3, then after that you can't have no more children. My question to you is, how much do a Caesarean section cost now? Do you know?
I mean, I don't know the billing side of it because I'm not a gynecologist, but the C-section, first of all, it's not true that you can only have it 3 times. I know I have 2 or 3 patients that had C-section 4th time or 5th time. So it's just generally understood that you can do it only 3 times, but that's not the case. It's not true. You can have it more. And secondly, once you have a C-section, it's not the case you always have to have a C-section. I've seen people, women, that had a C-section, then they gave birth naturally. So it's a little more complicated than that. Secondly, the issue is why do they do so many C-sections? I believe they're overdone in America because it's easier to do a C-section, and they probably make more money off it. That's a sad reality. So
Yes, yes.
that's probably why they're done a lot. So,
They said that they charging $10,000 now for a C-section. So you're right.
probably more than that.
Well,
Probably more than
when it first came out, it was $10,000.
Yeah.
It's probably more than that now. But the point I'm bringing out is that
They'll make more money doing
Yes.
a C-section, and it's easier because they just do it quickly.
Yes.
So that's the problem with when medicine becomes a business, and the business model is here in America, the medical industry rewards procedures. Financially, there's more financial incentive in doing procedures and surgeries than in not doing them. So there's this financial incentive to perform them. I mean, most doctors are trustworthy, but not everyone is. So even if you're trustworthy, in the back of your mind, if you have this thing, I'll make $10,000 if I do this, versus maybe $500 not doing it, it's always going to be there in your mind, and that's not healthy as a way of operation. So I'll admit that, medicine is very incentivized in the wrong way. It incentivizes illness more than health. They're trying to change that now, but it's going to take a lot of rocking the boat to change. But illness, people make more money off illness than health. I mean, medical professionals, I mean. Yeah. Right, Samra.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة
Right, sound.
حي على الصلاة
That's what
حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر La